In this tutorial series, I'm going to be concepting, modeling, texturing, rigging, and grooming two characters. A female snow leopard character and a male hare character. Initially, I had decided to just create a female snow leopard character, but since I haven't created a male character in over 6 months, I decided to add a male character to the course. Even though these characters are eventually going to be covered in fur, I'm going to be doing a fair amount of work defining their anatomy in certain areas. In this video, I'm going to give a general overview of the project as I concurrently showcase the process of concepting both of the characters. Being that this is an intermediate to advanced course, rather than turning it into a Photoshop tutorial, I want to instead talk about the ideation process and how I plan on resolving the challenges that these character designs present to the 3D modeling, texturing, rigging, and grooming process. I feel like that is more valuable information for this course. One of the first things I did was Google Anthro snow leopard and hare to see how other people resolved their designs. I found a mix of human and AI crafted artworks to point me in the right direction. I also have some reference of a real snow leopard and hare, which I will talk about shortly. I start by doing some warm-up scribbles. The objective is to get the bad drawings out of my system. Since I'm going to be starting off with head sketches, you'll see me sketching some construction lines for a head in perspective. I like this blue construction line look for scribbling. It reminds me that I'm not being serious, just doodling. It's very easy to flatten an image during sketching, so all these perspective exercises are important. Sometimes I'll also take a shot at these simplified stick figures, either pose in extreme poses or just standing over there. It really helps me to just get in the mood. If I feel like it's getting too serious, I go back to scribbling. This is an exercise that will help you practice straight line drawing and circle drawing. I will admit though, nowadays I'll draw different parts of the circle as many times as needed to get it looking perfect. It's easier than trying to get a perfect circle in one stroke. For this project, when I was done with the scribbling stage, I moved straight to the female snow leopard character. What I like to do initially, what is advised, is to sketch snow leopards from a photorealistic image source. I wanted to get as much information as possible from the real-life reference to help me sketch the female snow leopard character. Thankfully, I had a lot of reference footage from a previous snow leopard project that I was working on. I managed to gather a whole bunch of snow leopard headshots and full body shots and assemble them in one document. The project I worked on though was a little bit hyper-realistic, so I was going for something that a CFX artist could use for simulation, for like a Ziva VFX simulation. So I went for a very hyper-realistic look. So I'm a little bit familiar with snow leopard forms, but I'm sketching again to re-familiarize myself with the forms. When it comes to female characters, it's always good to reduce the amount of lines or detail describing their forms. Unless you're going for an older character. The snout of a snow leopard travels straight down, but I decided to add a shelf-like plain break on the nose. It stops the character from looking too avatarish. Not to say that's not a cool look, but for this character, I want to go with something that would fit more in the Zootopia world. However, what I do not want is for the character to look too cartoony or to look like it's intended for a children's cartoon. I want the character to look edgier. I want the eyes to be beady and more menacing, something that would fit well into the League of Legends world. I took a short detour to try something a little bit more hyper-realistic. She was starting to look more like something that would work for the Guardians of the Galaxy universe. That would have been really cool because I would have been aiming for a more realistic groom in 3D. But as fun as that sounds, I don't want the groom to be so resource intensive that it becomes difficult to manage and takes forever to render. I could always come up with a workflow to manage the high resource groom in 3D and also delegate rendering to a render farm service. But I realize that this more hyper-realistic look is a big deviation from the original plan I had been mulling on for a few days. So I decided to reel myself in and stick with the original plan, the League of Legends-esque style I was heading in. This final sketch is what I'm certain is the beginning of the final concept. Keeping the eyes low and giving the character a bigger forehead makes the character look a lot more feminine. Combining that with even beadier eyes makes her look more menacing. Leaving the pupil and the iris out makes her look even more evil. I'm definitely sure I will give myself some texture options of the eyes without the pupil and the iris to allow the character to transform into a more evil character if the animated shot demands it. So here's the outfit I'm going to be clothing this character in. A latex jumpsuit from Zasua Sportswear, urban streetwear athletic pants from the clothing brand Screenshot, a cropped puffer jacket I found on fashionova.com, and these Balenciaga speed sneakers. I will not be adhering to the exact designs from most of these references, but some things like the sneakers will be modeled as is. For this character, I want to practice a heftier body type, especially since the last female character I created was fairly slim. The inspiration for her body type comes from an old MMORPG called Wakfu. Wakfu characters are more ham-limbed, so their shins and ankles are fairly thick. I want to try something like that, but with more muscular arms. This character is a dancer, and I want her build to reflect that. Also, snow leopards have a heftier look because of the thick layers of fur they're covered in. So I want the character to have a thickness to her. A majority of the character concepts I create are modeled by me. So I take a lot of liberties when it comes to the type of information I decide to emphasize in my concept sketches. The main objective is to familiarize myself with the forms that I'm going to be sculpting before I jump into ZBrush. So my concept sketching process is mostly a mannequinization exercise. The other things I'm paying attention to is proportions and cohesiveness of the attire being concepted. Whether or not the elements of clothing and props I'm thinking about are working well together. Other important things I'm thinking about are if the choices I'm making are going to make the character difficult to animate. So I'm done with her body on the main reference sheet. I just have to fix the legs in the front view. They look freakishly large. There is no way I'm going to be able to fit the sneakers on there comfortably. So with her head, one of the things I'm looking to modify from my previous head discovery sketches is moving her facial features closer to the center of her face. It makes her head feel fluffier. That might or might not be something I want. We'll see how it turns out. One of the important things I have to keep in mind for this character is how I'm going to process her markings or spots. Usually, furry animals have a different underlying skin color in comparison to what you're seeing on their fur. It's usually a grayish or peachy color, with darker gray spots on the more melanated areas that define the color of their markings. Why is this important? If you can mimic this with your groom, your furry character designs will feel a lot more tangible. This effect is also visible at the snout, where the fur thins out. Based on my research, the black color of the nose blends into the peachy or gray color of the underlying skin. Here is an example of it showcased on one of my Wildcat products. One of the reasons I wanted to do this bodysuit is because I want to attempt a latex texture in Substance Painter. I am, however, worried about how it will clash with the fairly glossy material of the puffer jacket. If at the texturing stage, the two glossy materials don't stack well, I'll definitely consider changing the material of the bodysuit to something with rougher highlights. Another thing I did was start out the bodysuit with a lot of paneling. I almost immediately scaled back the detail to get a more simplified result. I have to take into consideration how much ruffled detail the jacket has. Add the ruffled detail of the puffer jacket with the excessive amount of panels I was adding to the bodysuit, and I can already see an over-detailed design in progress. This is one of the things that is good to keep track of at this early stage. You want a good amount of detail contrast. Whether it's contrasting glossy detail or contrasting clothing details. This is a good photo of a balanced amount of glossiness between a less glossy underlying bodysuit and a much glossier crop jacket. And also a good balance of creasing detail between the slight creasing of the bodysuit and the high frequency ruffling of the cropped puffer jacket. I'm considering going with the completely rough result of this white bodysuit shown here, if the two glossy materials clash at the shading stage, even though I have scaled back on the amount of detail that the bodysuit has. One thing I have postponed a little too long is a discussion on the specifications I'm going for with these characters. These characters are intended for use in broadcast, film, and advertising. So I'm going to be utilizing the most amount of geometry, UV tiles, and fur guides needed to get some production quality film renders. I'm going to be mostly using these characters to practice advanced body dynamics by the way of dance animations. I will also later be using them for acting shots, so they are going to have facial rigs with all the bells and whistles that a production level rig should have. Another big portion of this project that needs to be discussed is the rigging phase. In this course, I'm going to show how to use a list of resources to get a production level animation friendly rig. An animation friendly rig means the rig is more targeted towards animators and not mocap or other methods of automating animation. As an animator, there are some basic features that we require of a character rig to allow us to work comfortably. I'm going to list these basic features and showcase them concurrently on the right side of the screen. You need IK and FK options for at least the limbs, so that is the hands and the legs. If more appendages have IK FK functionality, that's good, but for me, I only need to see them on the hands and the legs. Next is squash and stretch for the limbs in both IK and FK mode. IK FK blending for the limbs. An IK FK matching tool for the limbs. Automatic or no flip and manual or pull vector control of the knee in IK mode. Stretchy or translatable knees for fixing knee pops on walk cycles. Snappable elbows and knees to pin the elbows and knees in space. Bendy controls for the limbs to get some wacky animation or to emphasize force in poses. Foot rolling, which is the pivoting about the heel and the ball of the foot. Foot banking, which is side to side movement or pivoting about the sides of the feet. Leaning, which is the leaning of the shins with the foot planted. Basic toe rotation. Toe spinning, which is rotating the entire foot with the front of the foot or toe as the pivot point. Space switching for everything connected to the torso. IK and FK functionality for the spine. Basic head controls, so basic rotation controls, reverse jaw controls. Then we need basic eye controls. So that's the typical aim vector eye control system. You need eyelid controls, blinking controls, fleshy eyelids, which is the reaction of the eyelids to the bulge of the cornea, fleshy eye region, which is the movement of the entire eye, brow, and cheek region, pupil and iris constriction and dilation. Even though the iris cannot constrict or dilate, it is useful for animators to have this feature. Then we need basic mouth controls. Cheek creasing when the corner of the lip moves up. We need to be able to purse the lips. We need to be able to make an M shape, or what would be classified as a reverse pursing. And the last but not least, we need blend shapes for other unique expressions. I don't think I left anything out, but if I did, I will definitely add it when we get to the rigging stage. The main resource I'm going to be using for the rigging phase is a free course on YouTube. The secondary resource I'm going to be using for the head rig and some additional rig features is a paid tutorial resource called Pluralsight. All other features tailored specifically for these characters are going to be completed with general rigging techniques in Maya. The rigging portion is going to be very extensive, so this is just a brief summary. I can't wait to get to that stage so I can share a lot of valuable tips and tricks with you all. So we've come to the end of her reference sheet development. I decided to keep the ruffles out of her sketches because I felt it would distract from the more important things to pay attention to at this stage. The ruffles are a form I would classify as secondary or tertiary. I had been contemplating the dreadlocks at the ideation stage, but after sketching her in her first casual pose, I realized that she needed it. It helps to emphasize her femininity. We'll be getting to the casual poses shortly after I get done with the Anthro Hare's concepting. I don't want the dreadlocks to be too much of a burden on the XGen system, so most of the detail from the dreadlocks will be done in ZBrush. I might possibly end up exporting some fiber mesh strands from ZBrush as polygons to help it transition into the XGen groom of the head. Or I might just designate the entire task of blending the dreadlocks with the groom to XGen. Because I don't have to worry about rigging any clothes with my end cloth approach to simulating sculpted clothing, I have a little bit more breathing room with other resources. Speaking of end cloth, I will be using a slightly different approach to simulating the bubble jacket than I did in my Simulating ZBrush Sculpted Clothing with End Cloth tutorial series. This bubble jacket might require some inflation properties from the end cloth system and also a different type of proxy mesh for end cloth to use. I'll talk about it more when we get closer to that stage of development. As you can see, I do a very large and bushy tail. This is not even an exaggeration because snow leopard tails are actually longer than their body's length. They have the longest tails amongst all the wild cats. It's time to move on to the Anthro Hare. I know he's going to have tall ears, so I don't want to make him too tall. It will become very difficult to capture him in frame comfortably. I'm shooting for a height of 5'9" to 5'11". I have to admit that this hare character is highly influenced by Bugs Bunny, but as I mentioned with this character set, I don't want a super cartoony result. So I'm dialing back on the cuteness and going for something edgier. The two things that definitely have to go are the oval eyes and the buck teeth. I started out with ear shapes that are more closer to a hare or jackrabbit's ears, but it looked a bit odd. It feels like it will draw attention away from the face every time it's in frame. I don't ever want that. So I'm settling with this slightly more tapered look you will see with Bugs Bunny or the Google results of a Anthro Hare or rabbit. While fleshing out a particular gesture, I came across this really cool scalene triangle shape that I like. When we get to the casual pose sketching phase, I will discuss some changes that I made to make this scalene triangle shape a bit more tangible in 3D. This is the fit I'm going to be modeling for the Anthro Hare. This reference is from the Fear of God clothing brand. This second one here is from Shein USA. And these are the Jordan 6s from the infamous Jordan brand. Once again, I'd like to mention that I am not going to match the detail for these references to a T, except the sneakers. Watching me model the sneakers will be a good exercise for those of you who want to be 3D modelers. As I mentioned earlier, he's going to be about 5'9" to 5'11" in height. I'm sketching him with a slimmer build, but he might end up being something between a slim and average build. This system of cubes you see me using to gauge the ribcage and the pelvis is something I learned from Reich on YouTube. Check out his YouTube page, he is an exceptional artist. One thing I did with my last character design that I'm going to avoid with these two characters was modeling the character to stand on the ball of her feet. It's a common thing artists do when modeling anthro animals. For me, it made the rigging process a bit more complicated since I'm putting regular shoes on these characters. So this time around, both of these characters will have their feet planted. If your characters are going to stand on the ball of their feet, you might want to consider tailoring the sneakers to accommodate the animal-like stance. This is some artwork by an artist called Sparks123 on furryaffinity.net, and he does a pretty good job with tailoring his sneakers to fit the animal-like stance. I'm going to talk a little bit about resurfacing, UVing, and detail maps, and then we'll get back to the discussion about design when I start sketching his clothing. I mentioned something earlier about using UDIMs for these characters. I'm going to expand on it a bit further. Because these characters are for film and advertising, I want high quality textures that will allow the audience to see good fabric detail on the clothing on close-up shots. So the clothing are going to utilize a fair amount of UDIM tiles. However, when it comes to the skin, because most of their skin is going to be covered in fur, I do not want to allocate too many UV tiles to the skin textures. I'm not going to be working with any normal maps for this project. Normal map files can get very big, not bigger than Displacement, but they add up, especially when you're using UDIM format of UVing. The Displacement maps and final geometries I take into Maya will provide all the detail needed, so there's no need to burden memory, file loading, and render times with additional detail maps. Another thing that is going to help grab even more detail is the auto bump feature that most shaders have. I think I've seen the feature in Blender too. It pulls granular data out of the displacement map that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get with a reasonable amount of subdivision of your mesh during displacement. I do want to point out, however, that displacement maps will be baked for everything except the characters' bodies. I'm also doing this here because their bodies are going to be covered in a groom. There is no need to define detail on a displacement map for the skin if they are completely going to be covered in fur. This might hurt exposed areas of the skin like the nose and areas around the eyelids that are not covered in fur, but to accommodate them, I will add more geometry to those areas at the resurfacing stage if it is needed. I'm not going to get into it too much here, but Manual resurfacing will be essential for certain meshes of these characters, while automatic resurfacing will do for others. I want to mention one more thing about XGen. Because I know the issues I'm going to be running into with XGen, I'm going to try to be as economical as possible with the groom. For one, the attire choices for these characters are not a coincidence. Their bodies are covered up fairly well to allow me to focus the grooming to the key exposed areas: the head, neck, hands, and tail for the female snow leopard, and the head, hands, tail, and legs for the male hare. I decided to expose his legs for fur by picking shorts for him because his tail is not as large as the snow leopard character and therefore won't require too much grooming. It doesn't mean the rest of their bodies won't ever be groomed. If I decide to create new clothing for these characters, I can add more groom on the newly exposed areas. But for the starter character asset, it will be nice to be able to focus on just the key areas mentioned above for each character. Okay, let's get back to his design. Even though I am putting a lot of creasing detail on the sweater, I'm going to be very strategic about what creasing I delegate to the modeling process and what I let end cloth simulate creases for. The bundled up creasing at the forearm is definitely going to be sculpted. All the creasing on the torso is not going to be sculpted in ZBrush. Baking in creasing data there will just look weird at animation or render time. For the torso, I will count on end cloth to develop the creases based on how the character is posed. This is very similar to what I did with my last character rig. End cloth can still add its own creases to the bundled up fabric on the arm, but for the most part, I am looking to paint property maps to control how much creasing is happening on the bundled fabric at the forearm. You will notice that for most of my character designs, I like outfits that are bottom heavy if they're not top heavy, or top heavy if they're not bottom heavy. So it produces a kind of offset that appears to be more interesting than just making the character wear all fitted or all baggy clothing for the upper and lower torso. In order to increase the fidelity of all my clothing's logos and lettering, I like to make them separate pieces of geometry. This is also the case with seams or threading. For stylized characters intended for close-up renders, this is a better choice than baking the data into a texture map. If you bake these logos and threading and you don't have very large texture maps, the results will look very cheap, like something you would see in an old or mobile video game. You might be wondering why I am not doing any coloring. I know I'm going to be experimenting with color on the final models in Substance Painter, so there's no need to tie down any color schemes. I'm also almost always creating an asset that is going to be using a modular color system. So that means there will be several skin and outfit colors to pick from, and mix and match. For me, the coloring of the character even sometimes extends beyond the character development stage and into the animation phase. Sometimes I will recolor the character after having utilized all the color options several times in various animation projects. For now though, when it comes to the skin and fur, I'm planning to stick with the natural color of a snow leopard and a hare. Right now, I'm only interested in how well the designs work as far as silhouettes and posing is concerned, and also form. These sneakers are going to be very difficult to model. They have so much organic detail, connected in so many complicated ways. The sole is even more complex than the body of the sneaker. A lot of folks like to model something like this in as few pieces as possible. This helps facilitate an easier skinning process at the rigging stage. I, however, like to cut it into as many pieces as possible. This allows me to end up with better topology for complex pieces. And it is also so much easier to resurface when you cut them into several different pieces. As far as quality is concerned, it will always deform and render better than a sneaker model that has been welded into one mesh. Most of these pieces are different materials, so it makes sense to at least divvy them up in pieces based on what material they are. This will definitely help with the shading of the sneaker and also the use of it for complex VFX projects. Dividing the pieces also limits the amount of normal and displacement data you need. Quite frankly, you can also get away with no normal and displacement if each piece is crafted as a singular mesh. One of the other reasons why it's easier to get away with having so many pieces is because the only deformation you really have to worry about is at the toe and ball of the sneaker. The body of the sneaker, for the most part, behaves like a rigid body. The only other deformation to expect is on the part of the sneaker that extends above the ankles. I have a sneaker tutorial on my page that shows how to rig high-top sneakers. I will be revisiting those techniques to rig these Jordan 6s. Her sneakers are going to be a lot easier to model and rig. I made these choices on purpose because I don't want to just pick an easy piece for those interested in modeling sneakers. The Jordan 6s will allow me to show you a plethora of skills for modeling complex sneakers in ZBrush and Maya. One feature I'm going to add to both sneakers is a smearing control that allows me to stretch the heel and the toe of the sneaker to simulate motion blur. In my last model, I only did it for the heel. This time we'll be doing it for the front and the back of the sneaker. Another thing to take note of is that both of these characters have drawstrings for their pants and shorts. Initially, I had only intended to simulate them with end cloth, but after doing some casual sketches, which I'm going to review shortly, I realized that I need to provide a rigging option so I can take control of the posing of the drawstrings for some animations. So this is the final reference sheet for the Hare character. It looks fairly simple, but when the detail of the creasing, embossed lettering on the shorts, and complex detail of the sneakers are sculpted, it will look really detailed. The final stage of this concepting process is what I like to call the casual pose sketching phase. In 2020, I was working on an animated series and I was attracted to this stage of development where you sketch your characters in casual poses. I was happy to add the process to my workflow because I knew it would get me excited about creating the characters. It helps to see them alive and emoting. But the more I did it, the more I realized many more reasons why this step is essential. It helps me to see how grounded the character idea is. Sketching the characters in natural poses lets you know if the clothing ideas will work well together when posed. It can also let me know what kind of posing issues I'm going to run into with the silhouette. Very rarely do I have to change the entire character idea, but sometimes this stage motivates major changes. Trying to capture the facial expressions of the reference also helps me to see what I can expect from the final rigged character. I would hate to have to wait till the characters are rigged to get a proper visual of their facial expressions. This exercise is also very good for animators and illustrators in general, because trying to capture the essence of your reference is important. So for this section, what I've decided to do is give you a summary of this stage and how it helped to improve these two characters. At the end of this summary, I will allow the casual pose sketches to play as a sped up time lapse without any narration over them. If you are interested in watching them being drafted, stick around after the summary to watch the rest of the close to 35-minute sketching session. Or you can use the YouTube chapters feature to jump to the ones you are interested in. Even though this video plays in a particular sequence, most of these final casual pose sketches ended up motivating changes that I had to go back and update my final reference sheets with. I would have done a lot more, but there's too much work to be done, so I settled with 4 casual poses for each character. This first one motivated me to go back and add dreadlocks to the snow leopard character. This one lets me know for sure that spots should be scattered across the entire face. It also made me wary about how the jacket is going to impact her silhouette during animation, but I'm not too worried about that. This one made me consider emphasizing the groom on the cheeks a lot more so that I can get a furrier face and not a sloping or arched jawline. It also reminded me that bigger lashes emphasize her femininity a lot. I may or may not want that, or I may want to give myself both of those options on the final rig. This one motivated me to rig the dreadlocks with a control that allows me to lean the entire hairstyle to either side when animating because it produces a very nice asymmetrical result. Also for this one, I did not contain her facial features to the center part of her head, and I kind of like the end result, so I might consider that change at the modeling phase. For the hair, this sketch of him attempting a smile let me understand that the triangle eyes look cool in a sketch, but when I get to 3D, it might not compute as well as expected. It would be better if I made his entire eye socket a triangle instead of his actual eye. So I'm planning on keeping his eye a natural almond shape so that I can nail normal eye poses during animation, and then count on the cheeks and his brow to create the triangle shape that makes me like his facial design. This shot made me consider putting fur on his knees, especially if his face is going to be fluffy. His elbows I'm not worried about so much because they will remain covered, and as I already mentioned, I'm only grooming the part of the bodies that are visible to optimize the character for rendering and general management. This one definitely let me know that I have to create sunglass props for him, but it was the first one that let me know that the ear rig should be very flexible. So flexible that I'm going to rely on an Anthro Hare and NURBS driven ribbon system to allow me a lot of flexibility. This last one is the one that let me know that I have to create a rig option for the drawstrings of his shorts and her sweatpants. As I mentioned before, initially I had decided to only rig them with end cloth, but after creating this pose, I realized that I want an option to have full control of them so I can pose them freely during animation. The other thing that all these sketches also made me confirm is that the rig is going to utilize stand-in geometry to help me know what the silhouette of the final fur is going to look like. I want to be able to load in the groom that have been previously saved to a file from the grooming phase. This way I can animate comfortably with the stand-ins, letting me know what space the grooms occupy, and then turn them off to render when the groom presets are loaded in. This is also going to be done for the clothing. Her bubble jacket, for example, and his shorts are so baggy, and since I'm using an end cloth solution and workflow that allows me to simulate the clothing after animation is done, I realized that I need proxies to let me approximate how they are going to affect the silhouette of the character at animation time. So just like the fur, I'll be using some simple primitives to create stand-ins for the clothing. So this concludes my summary of the casual pose sketching process. I have provided all the sketching time lapses of these sketches for the rest of this video for those who are interested in watching. The reference for these casual poses came from some popular artists, models, and comedians. As I mentioned before, you can use YouTube chapters to skip to the sketches you are interested in. The more time you spend on the concepting phase, tying down your ideas, the less likely you are going to be trying to clarify ideas at the modeling phase. If you are a beginner 3D modeler, you do not want to be trying to resolve major design flaws at the modeling phase. It can be very deflating trying to figure out the software and your design at the same time. You can see if a particular shape or silhouette is going to work here by simply laying down lines. They don't have to be complete drawings with inking and shading if you don't want to do that. Ultimately, this process is going to make you so much more comfortable with laying down form when you get into ZBrush, especially if you spend most of your time at the concepting phase visualizing the mannequinized version of your character. If you find yourself making major changes at the sculpting or modeling phase, it means you didn't do a good job fleshing out your ideas at the concepting phase, especially in a case like this where the characters need to be groomed further down the pipeline. Without this step, you are going to wait a long while to start visualizing what the end result looks like with fur. I'd like to mention that you can also do the concepting process in ZBrush with Dynamesh if you are more comfortable with that. But make sure you acknowledge that you are concepting and that what you are concepting is not the final model. This will allow you to be fluid and be more open to experimenting and discarding ideas that are not working. I may have left out some things that I may decide to put in the sculpting stage in ZBrush, but for the most part, I think the characters' ideas are pretty much finalized. I may add a prop or two here and there, or add some additional detail to certain articles of clothing or hairstyles, but this is expected when converting most 2D concepts into 3D models. I was a little bit all over the place with this tutorial, but this is because there are a lot of different things to consider when the intention is to draft something that is going to be turned into a groomed, animation-friendly 3D rig. If anything is unclear, please feel free to shoot me questions in the comment section. In the next lesson in this tutorial series, I will start sculpting the body or the anatomies of these two characters. Have fun watching the time lapses. I will see you in the next lesson.